somewhere in the Solomon Islands, in 1943, a man walked out to the edge of an airfield and stopped in front of a wrecked fighter plane. The plane was a Bell P-39 era Cobra. Its engine sat behind the pilot's seat, which left the nose empty, and into that empty nose, the Army had bolted a 37mm automatic cannon. The wings were gone. The fuselage was broken. The gun was perfect. He was a sailor, not a pilot. His boat was 2 layers of mahogany planking, 3,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, and 4 torpedoes designed before the First World War that could not hit anything that mattered anymore. So he went and got a cutting torch. Nobody wrote his name down, not in the squadron log, not in the official history, not in any archive in Washington. We know the guns came off those wrecks. We know they were bolted onto the bows of wooden boats and carried into the dark against an enemy who never expected them. We know what the Americans said. The Japanese started calling those boats devil boats, but the man who cut that first cannon out of the coral and carried it down to the water, that man is gone. This is his story. Anyway, if you're one of the generation that remembers these stories, we're honored you're here. What year were you born? On October 12th, 1942, 4 wooden boats came into Tulagi Harbor and tied up under the mangroves at a place called Sasapi. They were Elko boats, 77 feet long, built in Bayonne, New Jersey, by men who had spent the 1930s making pleasure yachts for people with money. Their numbers were PT-38, PT-46, PT-48, and PT-60. The water they had come to patrol had a name the sailors had already learned, Iron Bottom Sound. It was called that because of what was lying on the floor of it. Understand what these boats were. The hull was 2 layers of mahogany planking, each layer 1 inch thick, laid diagonally across each other over frames of laminated wood. Between the 2 skins was a sheet of airplane fabric soaked in marine glue and ironed flat. That was the armor. That was all of it. A rifle bullet went through a PT boat the way a nail goes through a shingle. Inside that shell were 3 Packard engines, 12 cylinders each, and 3,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, 100 octane. The same fuel that went into fighter planes. It was carried in tanks that ran most of the length of the boat under the feet of the men who stood at the wheel. A boat like that could do better than 40 knots. It could turn inside anything the Japanese Navy had. It could come out of the dark at a destroyer and be gone before the searchlight found the water where it had been. And bolted to its deck, 2 on each side, were 4 torpedo tubes. The torpedo inside those tubes was called the Mark 8. It had been designed before the First World War. Some of the men loading it had grandfathers who were younger than that torpedo. When it was drawn on paper, it weighed well over a ton. It carried a warhead packed with hundreds of pounds of TNT, and when it worked, it could break a ship in half. When it worked, the Mark 8 ran at 27 knots. A Japanese destroyer could do better than 30. It ran deeper than it was set to run. And if you set it shallow to compensate, it porpoised, breaking the surface and diving again, announcing itself the whole way in. Below about 8 feet, the men had learned you could not trust it at all. But the worst of it was the tube. The Mark 18 tube pushed the torpedo out with a charge of black powder, the stuff of muskets, and inside every tube was a film of grease. And when the charge went off, the grease caught fire. Every torpedo a PT boat fired left the tube inside a bloom of orange flame and a cloud of black smoke. Think about what that means on a moonless night in the Solomon Islands. The whole reason the boat existed was that it could not be seen. It was small, it was low, it was quiet and idle, and it was painted the color of the sea before dawn. It lived by being nowhere, and the instant it used the weapon it had been built to carry, it lit itself up like a match struck in a dark room. and every gun on every Japanese ship in that stretch of water knew exactly where to look. The Japanese were running ships down the chain of islands almost every night. Destroyers, mostly, fast, and coming at night because American planes owned the daylight. They brought troops and rice and ammunition to the soldiers on Guadalcanal who were trying to take Henderson Field back. The Americans called those runs the Tokyo Express, which was a joke, and like most jokes told in a war, it was not funny to the men who had to go out and meet it. On the night of October 13th, the 4 boats went out. Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery led them. He rowed aboard PT-60. Behind him in the dark were Robert Searles in PT-38, Henry Taylor in PT-46, and Robert Wark in PT-48. It was the first time American torpedo boats had attacked anything in the Solomon Islands. Nobody in that group had done this before. Nobody had done this before at all. The Japanese force they went out to meet was there to shell Henderson Field. The boats came apart in the darkness almost immediately, the way small boats do when there is no moon and no radar worth the name, and the sea is black and the men are young. Robert Searles, alone in PT-38, found something large. He thought it was a cruiser. He closed on it and fired 2 torpedoes at 400 yards. And then he closed again and fired 2 more at 200 yards. 200 yards is nothing. It is close enough to see the shape of a man against the sky. He reported a double explosion forward of the bridge. Robert Wark took PT-48 in on a destroyer and fired at about the same range. Henry Taylor, somewhere out in the dark in PT-46, saw explosions and could not say whose they were. The squadron came home and claimed 3 torpedo hits. Here is the part that the men did not know for a long time afterward. And here is why this story is worth telling, honestly. Japanese records do not confirm those hits. Not one of them. 4 young men in wooden boats went into under 300 yards against warships that could have erased them with a single shell, fired the weapons their Navy had given them, believed they had struck home, and there is no evidence in the enemy's own accounting that anything happened at all. And PT-60, the boat, the commander himself was riding, idling in close to the beach, trying to stay out of the destroyer's gunfire, drifted onto a coral reef. The coral opened her hull. She sat there in the dark with the water coming in and the fight going on around her. It took a yard patrol boat to drag her off. She was out of the war for something like 7 months. That was the first night. That was the debut. The patrols went on week after week, out at dusk, back at dawn, sleeping in the heat under mosquito, netting in a place where the mud smelled like rot, and the malaria took more men than the Japanese did. The engines were run past what the manuals allowed. The mechanics kept them alive with parts that did not exist and were made anyway. There was a kind of tiredness in those men that does not have a name. It did not come from the work, and it did not come from the fear. It came from going out every night to look for the thing that could kill you, and finding it, and firing at it, and watching nothing happen. A man can carry fear. Fear is honest, and fear can be spent. And in the morning there is coffee. What wore them down was what lay underneath the fear. It was the suspicion, never once said out loud on the deck of a boat, that the weapon bolted beside him was something the Navy had lied to him about. And then, on the night of December 9th, something worked. PT-59 was patrolling off Coimbo Bay on the western end of Guadalcanal. Her skipper was Lieutenant John Searles, the brother of the man who had gone in at 200 yards on the first night. PT-44 was with him. They saw a barge first, then behind the barge, sitting on the surface, they saw the thing that had brought it. It was a submarine, 320 feet of it. It had come up out of the dark water to put a supply barge over the side and get rice and ammunition to men who were starving on that island. It never saw the boats. For a moment, nothing happened at all. The engines idled. The sea was flat and warm, and the air smelled of salt and diesel. And out there in front of them lay 320 feet of steel that had crossed an ocean to be in that exact patch of water on that exact night. And it did not know they existed. Searles fired 2 torpedoes at 400 yards. One of them ran under PT-44 and did not explode, which is what the Mark 8 did, and which is a sentence that should make you cold, because PT-44 was full of gasoline and full of men, and the torpedo went beneath her like a fish. The other one hit, the submarine was I-3, the water went up in a column, and she went down, and about 90 men went down inside her. 4 of them were blown clear into the sea and swam through the night to the beach at Guadalcanal, which was held by United States Marines, which meant they had survived a torpedo in order to reach an island where nothing was waiting for them but more war. John Searles received the Navy Cross, and there it is. The weapon worked. The torpedo designed before the First World War, fired from a tube that lit the sky, from a boat made of wood, killed a submarine of almost 2,000 tons. Every man in that squadron would have told you that night that the thing they carried in those 4 tubes was real, and that they knew how to use it. But look again at what that submarine was doing when the torpedo found her. She had surfaced to launch a barge, not a warship, a barge, a flat wooden and steel box with a diesel engine in it, 40-some feet long, sitting so high in the water that a man could wade out and put his hand on the bottom of it. It could carry 70 soldiers. It could carry 10 tons of rice or ammunition or a light tank. It could not shoot back at anything worth mentioning. It could not run away. It could barely make 8 knots, and it drew less than 3 feet of water. Every man on PT-59 watched that barge in the dark, and not one of them understood yet what they were looking at. They were looking at the end of the torpedo. They were looking at the thing that was about to take their entire reason for existing and make it worthless. And they were looking at it on the best night that squadron ever had. The Japanese were about to stop sending destroyers. They were going to send thousands of those barges instead, close to shore, in the dark, hugging the coastline of every island in the Solomons. And the boats at Tulagi would go out and find them and fire the weapons they had, and come home with nothing, night after night, nothing at all. In February of 1943, the Japanese took their soldiers off Guadalcanal in the dark and went north. They did not surrender the Solomon Islands. They moved up the chain, island by island, and they dug in, and they went on feeding the men they left behind. But they had learned the same lesson the Americans had learned from the other side of it. Destroyers were too valuable and too visible. Every fast run down the slot cost them ships. They could not replace. So they stopped sending destroyers. They sent barges. The Japanese called it the Daihatsu. It was about 47 feet long and about 10 feet across the beam. And it was the least romantic object in the entire Pacific War. A flat ramp at the bow, a single diesel engine that made 60 horsepower and pushed it along at 8 knots, which is the speed of a man jogging. It could carry 70 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, or 10 tons of rice and ammunition, or 1 light tank. Some of them mounted a machine gun. Some of them carried heavier guns. Some of them had steel added along the sides by crews who had learned what happened when they did not. And it drew less than 3 feet of water. That is the whole story. That single fact rewrote the war for every torpedo boat in the South Pacific. Understand the geometry of it. A torpedo does not fly. It swims. It runs at a depth you set before you fire it. And once it leaves the tube, that depth is what it has. The Mark 8 could not reliably be set shallower than about 8 feet, because below that it porpoised. And a porpoising torpedo is a torpedo that jumps out of the water and dives back in and misses 8 feet down. The barge floated in under 3. So the torpedo ran perfectly. It ran straight and true and level. exactly as the men who built it in 1911 had intended, and it passed beneath the flat bottom of the barge with 5 feet of black water to spare. And it kept going out into the empty ocean until the engine ran dry and it sank. Nothing happened. Nothing at all. The men on the barge felt the wake go under them. If they felt anything, then they went onto the beach and unloaded the rice. Night after night, the boats found them. And night after night, the boats fired the weapons the United States Navy had issued them, and the weapons worked flawlessly and accomplished nothing. You could put 4 torpedoes into a barge convoy at 200 yards and watch every one of them run true and watch every one of them run under. There was no malfunction to report. There was no defect to fix. The torpedo was not broken. The torpedo was simply the wrong object, and there is a particular cruelty in that for a young man in a wooden boat, because you cannot even be angry at a machine that is doing exactly what it was built to do. They had machine guns, 2 twin 50 calibers in turrets, 1 on each side of the cockpit. The 50 caliber Browning is a serious weapon. It fires around the size of a man's thumb at nearly 3,000 feet per second, and it will go through the engine block of a truck against a wooden barge. It worked against a barge with steel plate bolted along its sides. It did not do it fast enough. And fast enough was the only thing that mattered. The rounds hit and sparked and went nowhere. You could pour 1,000 rounds into a barge and watch it keep going toward the beach at 8 knots with 70 men in it who would be shooting at Marines in the morning. So the boats had to close. Understand what closing means. It means you take a hull made of 2 layers of mahogany with 3,000 gallons of aviation gasoline under the deck with no armor anywhere on it, and you drive it toward men who are shooting at you until you are near enough that your bullets can do to their steel what your bullets were never designed to do. 400 yards, 300, 200, close enough that the muzzle flashes from the barge light up the faces of your own crew. And you did that in a boat that would burn. Gasoline is not like diesel. Diesel needs coaxing. Gasoline vapor takes a spark and takes the whole boat with it. Every man aboard knew that a single tracer round in the wrong place ended the argument permanently. And every man aboard went in anyway, because the alternative was to go home and report that the barges had gotten through again. Somebody had to give them a gun that could kill a barge. The first answer came from the Army, and it was not much of an answer. Early in 1943, in the Solomons and in New Guinea, both PT boat crews began bolting Army anti-tank guns to their bows. The 37mm anti-tank gun was a fine piece of equipment for its intended purpose, which was sitting in a hole in the ground in Europe waiting for a German tank. It fired a single shot. Then a man opened the breech, pulled the empty case out, put a new round in, closed the breech, and fired again. 1 shot at a time, in the dark, on a boat doing 30 knots through a chop with a machine gun firing back at you from 200 yards. The crews took the wheels off. They lashed the gun to the foredeck with timber and rope because there were no mounting points on a PT boat for a weapon like this, and no engineer in Washington had ever imagined there would need to be. It was not authorized. It was not in any manual. It was better than nothing, which is the highest thing that could be said about it. On the 1st of August, 1943, on the island of Rendova, a lieutenant named John Kennedy got hold of one of those guns. He was 26 years old and he commanded PT-109, an Elko boat, 80 feet of the same mahogany and the same gasoline. He traded the Army for the gun. His crew lashed it down to the forward deck on wooden planks. To make room, they took off a life raft. Read that again. To fit a weapon that fired 1 shot at a time, they removed a life raft. The next night, PT-109 was out in Blackett Strait with a group of other boats, waiting for Japanese destroyers running supplies down through the island. It was after 2 in the morning and there was no moon at all. Kennedy was idling on one engine to keep his wake down and his noise down, which was the correct thing to do, and which meant that when the shape came out of the dark ahead of him, he had almost no way to move. The destroyer was the Amagiri. She was more than 380 feet long, and she was doing better than 30 knots. And by the time anyone on PT-109 understood what they were looking at, there were perhaps 10 seconds left. She hit the boat on the starboard side and cut it in two. The gasoline went up. 2 men died in that instant. Andrew Kirksey, who had told his shipmates he did not believe he was going home. Harold Marney, who had been at his station for only a few minutes. They were both gone before anyone else on that boat understood that the boat no longer existed. Neither body was ever recovered. 11 men lived. They came up in burning water, and one of them, Patrick McMahon, the engineer, was burned over most of his body. And what they found floating in that oil and fire, what they got their hands on and held, was a timber. It was one of the planks. It was part of the crude wooden cradle that had been built to hold that useless single-shot anti-tank gun to the foredeck. The gun itself went to the bottom of Blackett Strait and never fired at anything. The wood that held it kept 11 men alive. They clung to that plank through the rest of the night. The 2 men who could not swim were lashed to it. And in the morning they pushed it ahead of them for hours through open ocean toward an island they were not sure was empty. Kennedy swimming with the strap of McMahon's life jacket clenched in his teeth, dragging the burned man behind him. Think about the hours in that water. The sea in the Solomons is warm as a bath, and it does not save you. It holds you up just enough to keep you alive long enough to understand exactly where you are. Around them was open ocean, and behind them was an oil fire burning on the surface where their boat had been. And above them was the sky with more stars in it than any of those men had seen over Boston or over Georgia. And none of it cared. They held on to a piece of lumber that a shipfitter had cut to hold down a gun. That was what there was. There is a lesson sitting inside that, and it is not a comfortable one. And it is not the lesson anybody wanted. The weapon they had improvised did nothing. The improvisation that saved them was the lashing. The Navy had sent these men out with a torpedo that could not hit the enemy. So they had bolted on a cannon that could not be reloaded. And the only part of the whole arrangement that ever saved an American life was the scrap lumber underneath it. They needed something better, not braver, better, and it was already sitting on Guadalcanal 3 miles inland from the beach, rotting in the sun. Henderson Field, by the middle of 1943, was a working airfield surrounded by a junkyard. The Marines had taken it in August of '42, and from that day it had been bombed and shelled and strafed and fought over, and everything that had ever been shot down or cracked up on landing had been dragged off the runway and left where it stopped. Wings folded back, engines torn out of their mount, aluminum going white and chalky in the salt air, vines coming up through the cockpits. Walk out there at midday and the heat comes up off the aluminum in waves. You can see the whole field smells of high-octane fuel and hot dust and the sweet rotting smell of the jungle pressing in on 3 sides of it. Sheet metal ticks as it expands in the sun. Somewhere a working engine is being run up on a test stand and the sound of it rolls across the coral and dies. And on either side of the strip lie the airplanes that will never fly again, arranged in no order at all, resting exactly where the tractors quit, pulling. Among that wreckage were the Airacobras. The Bell P-39 was one of the strangest aircraft anyone built in that war. Every other fighter put the engine in the nose, where it belonged, with the propeller bolted to the front of it. Bell did not. Bell put the engine behind the pilot, in the middle of the fuselage, and ran a drive shaft forward underneath the cockpit floor to turn the propeller. The pilot sat with a spinning steel shaft between his knees. There were reasons for this, and most of them turned out to be wrong. The Airacobra was not a great fighter. Above about 15,000 feet, it ran out of breath. And the Japanese Zero could climb over the top of it and stay there. The men who flew them in the Solomons had a hard war, but the design left the nose of that airplane completely empty. And into that empty nose, bel put a canon. It was the 37mm M4 automatic cannon. Built by Oldsmobile under contract to Colt, it weighed about 213 pounds. It sat along the center line of the aircraft and fired straight out through the hollow hub of the propeller. Between the blades, it fed from a magazine that was not a box and not a drum, but a long, curved, endless belt of 30 rounds. And the men who worked on it called that magazine the horse collar. It fired as many as 150 rounds a minute, 2.5 rounds every second. It threw a high explosive shell at 2,000 feet per second. That is not a machine gun. A machine gun makes holes. This was an automatic cannon, and every single thing that came out of it detonated when it arrived. It had been designed to break aircraft apart in the air and to punch through light armor on the ground. It was designed by men thinking about airplanes and about tanks. Not one of them, at any point, was thinking about a Japanese landing barge floating 3 feet deep off the coast of an island most Americans could not have found on a globe. Now consider what an Airacobra looks like after it has crashed. The wings sheer, the fuselage buckles, the engine sitting in the middle where it does not belong. Here's loose and destroys everything around it. The airplane, as an airplane, is finished. It will never fly again, and there is nothing on it worth carrying away, except that the cannon is in the nose, and the nose out ahead of the wing, ahead of the engine, is very often the part of the airplane that is left barrel intact, breech intact, recoil system intact, feed mechanism intact. 213 pounds of automatic cannon in perfect working order, lying in the coral at the edge of a runway with weeds growing up around it. 20 minutes by truck from a dock where wooden boats were tied up, whose crews were going out that night to shoot at armored barges with machine guns that could not hurt them. Somebody walked out there and looked at it. We do not know who. That is the truth. And it needs saying plainly, there is no name. The official history of the PT boats in the United States Navy, written after the war, gives this whole business 2 sentences. It says that early in 1943, experimental installations of single-shot anti-tank guns were made in both theaters. It says that soon afterward, automatic 37s were made available by the Army Air Corps, and that mounted on the bow, the automatic 37 became a standard installation. That is all. That is the entire official record of it. It does not say who first thought of it. It does not say what day it was. It does not say whether he was a gunner's mate or a machinist or an officer or a 19-year-old seaman who had never held a wrench before the war. Some of those guns were cannibalized from wrecked P-39s at Henderson Field. That is recorded. The man who did it is not. He walked out to a broken airplane in the heat with the smell of hot metal and jungle rot in his nose, and he looked at a weapon that the United States Army had given up on. Sitting in the wreck of an aircraft the United States Army had also more or less given up on, and he understood something that nobody in Washington had understood. Then he went and got a cutting torch. Nothing about it was simple. A PT boat has no gun deck. It has a wooden foredeck over wooden frames, built to keep the sea out, not to absorb the recoil of an automatic cannon. Bolt a 200-pound gun onto a plank and fire it. And the gun will try to leave the boat, and it will take the plank with it. So they built mounts. They cut steel out of whatever steel there was. They welded pedestals in shops that had been set up to fix outboard motors and generators. Nobody in the Bureau of Ordnance had approved any of it. Nobody had run the stress calculations, because there were no stress calculations, because nobody had ever done this before. Then they loaded the horse collar magazine, 30 rounds, 40 pounds of it, and they went out at dusk. Here is what changed, and it changed everything. A barge convoy in the dark, close in against the shore. Black hills behind it, running with no lights. The boat comes in. Before, this was the moment when the crew fired torpedoes and watched them run under. Now the boat keeps coming. And at 300 or 400 yards, a man on the bow presses a trigger. The muzzle flash lights the whole forward deck white. The recoil slams back, and the deck flexes underfoot, and the sound of it is not a rattle, but a hammering 2.5 times a second. And every shell that leaves that barrel arrives somewhere and explodes. 30 rounds, 12 seconds, a high explosive shell built to tear the wing off an airplane goes into the side of a Daihatsu barge carrying 10 tons of ammunition, and the barge is not damaged. The barge ceases to be. It comes apart and it burns, and what is left of it settles into the water. And the rice and the shells and the men in it go down into water so shallow that the wreck sits on the bottom with its ramp above the surface. And it is still there when the sun comes up. A man standing on the deck of that boat, 20 feet behind the gun, would carry the sound of it in his ears for the rest of his life. It came up through the soles of his boots before it reached him through the air. He would smell burnt cordite and gasoline and drifting back across the water from the thing he had just destroyed, diesel oil and scorched rice. He would see the shore go orange for a moment and then go black again. And his eyes, ruined by the muzzle flash, would show him nothing at all for the next 30 seconds while the boat ran on through the dark at 30 knots toward whatever was in front of it. Then somebody would call out that there was another barge, and the loader would kneel down and lift 40 pounds of steel and high explosive up onto the feed mechanism. And they would do it again. The Americans had found the weapon, but do not mistake this for a happy ending, and do not let anyone tell you that the men who did it got a safer war out of it. They got the opposite. A torpedo is fired from a distance. That was the entire point of a torpedo boat, that a small, cheap wooden hull could kill something enormous from far enough away that it might survive doing so. The 37-millimeter cannon was not a distance weapon. Its effective work was done inside a few hundred yards. At night, against a target that was shooting back with everything it had, the PT boat stopped being a boat that struck from the dark and slipped away. It became a gunboat. It became a wooden thing full of gasoline that drove straight at armed men and traded fire with them. Muzzle flash against muzzle flash. Close enough to hear them shouting. The barge crews were not helpless. They had machine guns. Some of the later barges carried guns heavy enough to hurt a PT boat badly, and they had one advantage that never went away and that no American cannon could take from them, which was that a barge is a steel box carrying rice, and a PT boat is a wooden box carrying 3,000 gallons of aviation gasoline. And when the same bullet hits each of them, only one of them turns into a torch. Men were shot off the deck and into the water in the dark and were not found. The gun that finally let them win, the barge war, was the same gun that required them to go close enough to lose everything. That was the bargain. And they took it, and they went out the next night and took it again. By the end of 1943, the 37-millimeter cannon was standard on the bow of PT boats in the Southwest Pacific. Not a field expedient, not a bootleg modification welded up in a shed. Standard. The Navy had looked at what these men had done with a hacksaw and a wrecked fighter plane and had made it doctrine somewhere in that year. On some island, the enemy started giving the boats a name. The Americans came to believe that the Japanese called them devil boats. Whether a Japanese sailor ever wrote those words down in his own language, in his own hand, is something no historian has ever proved. No captured document establishes it. The official history of the PT boats does not use the phrase at all. It comes to us secondhand through American memory, the way most of the things men say about their enemies come down to us. But something was out there in the darkness off those islands, coming in fast and low with a cannon on its bow, that had been cut out of the nose of a dead airplane, and the men on those barges knew it, and they had to call it something. On the 1st of September, 1943, 1 month after his boat was cut in half beneath him, John Kennedy took command of another one. Her number was PT-59. She was one of the old 77-foot Elkos, one of the boats that had been at Tulagi in the bad autumn of '42. She was the boat John Searles had been standing in at Coimbo Bay on the night the torpedo found the submarine. She had been out there for a year. She was tired, and Kennedy had her torn apart. They took off the torpedo tubes, all 4 of them. They took off the depth charges. Everything that made her a torpedo boat, everything the words in her name referred to, came off her deck and was set on the ground and left there. In place of it, they bolted 2 40-millimeter Bofors guns, 1 forward and 1 aft, and they lined her sides with machine guns behind steel shields, because by then everybody understood that the fight was going to happen at 200 yards, and that the men doing the shooting needed something between themselves and the answer. Look at what she had become. She was a patrol torpedo boat with no torpedoes. The Navy did not even pretend otherwise. In the paperwork, she was called a gunboat. This is the same idea that started with a man and a cutting torch in the weeds beside a runway, followed all the way to its end. It began with someone deciding that the weapon he had been issued was useless and that the weapon he needed was lying in a wreck. It ended with the Navy stripping the boats of the thing they were named for. On the night of the 1st of November, 1943, PT-59 went into a beach on the island of Choiseul. There were Marines there, paratroopers of a battalion that had been landed to make the Japanese believe an invasion was coming somewhere. It was not. It was a feint. The men were real. They had been fighting for days and they were cut off. And a landing craft carrying the wounded was sinking, and the boats went in to take them off. They loaded the Marines aboard. They put one of the badly wounded men below in the captain's own bunk. He died there. That is what a gunboat was for. A wooden boat with 2 Bofors guns and no torpedoes, running back out through the dark with a dead Marine in the skipper's bed. There is no medal in that sentence, and there is no glory in it. There is just the thing that happened. Kennedy stayed with that boat until the 18th of November, when a doctor looked at him and ordered him off it and into the hospital at Tulagi. His back had been ruined, and his stomach, and he had been sick for a long time and had not said so. He left the Solomon Islands just before Christmas. He never commanded anything again. The rest of it happened in factories. The 37-millimeter cannon that came out of the noses of dead Airacobras worked so well that the United States Navy did something it almost never did. It designed a gun for one purpose only. They called it the M9. It weighed 405 pounds, nearly twice what the aircraft gun weighed. Its barrel was 78 inches long, more than a foot longer, and it threw its shell at 3,000 feet per second instead of 2,000. A flatter trajectory, a longer reach, a gun a man could fight a barge with from far enough out that the barge might not reach him back. It was never meant for an airplane. It was never meant for a tank or a truck or a fortification. As far as the record shows, the only thing that gun was ever used on in the whole of the Second World War was a PT boat. Think about that for a moment. A weapon existed and was manufactured and was shipped across an ocean for no reason on earth except that some sailors nobody has ever named decided not to accept the equipment they had been given. They cut a cannon out of a broken fighter plane without asking permission. They welded a mount for it out of scrap in a shed. They took it out into the dark and they proved it. And a bureau in Washington, which had every institutional reason to say no, looked at what they had done and said yes, and then went further and built them a better one. By 1944, the boats came out of the yards in New Jersey and New Orleans with the gun already on the bow. new crews arrived in the Pacific and found it there, painted, mounted Standard in the manuals. They had no idea. They could not have known that the thing bolted to their foredeck had been born out of a wrecked airplane and a man's refusal. That is how it always goes. The improvisation becomes the equipment. The equipment becomes the doctrine. The doctrine becomes so ordinary that nobody remembers it was ever a decision. The boats fought all the way back, up the Solomons, along the coast of New Guinea, into the Philippines, into waters where the enemy no longer sent anything worth a torpedo. And so the guns did everything. They shot up barges and coastal shipping and shore positions. They ran men in and took men off. They burned and they sank. And the crews got out, or they did not. 531 PT boats served the United States in that war. 99 of them did not come back. Some were sunk by aircraft, some by shore guns, some by destroyers, some by mines, some were rammed, some were burned by their own crews to keep the enemy from getting them, some were destroyed by accident or by American aircraft that mistook them for something else, which is a way of dying that appears in the record without comment. In a list between one line and the next. And then the war ended. On the 15th of August, 1945, it stopped, and the Navy looked at what it had. It had hundreds of small wooden boats. They needed constant maintenance. Their engines were worn out. They drank aviation gasoline by the thousands of gallons. In a peacetime Navy, they were worth nothing at all. And they were on the far side of the world, and it would cost more to bring them home than they would ever be worth once they arrived. So on the 17th of October, 1945, at a base on the island of Samar in the Philippines, the crews stripped their boats. They took out the guns. They took out the engines, the radios, the instruments, anything that could be used again. They dragged the empty hulls up onto the beach, side by side, hull against hull, and they poured gasoline over them. Something like 118 boats burned on that sand. Men who had fought those boats stood on the beach and watched them go. There are photographs of the hulls burned from the inside out, the mahogany going, the frame standing a while longer against the light, the whole line of them along the waterline, pouring black smoke straight up into a Pacific sky. Nobody spoke in the way that nobody speaks at a burial. Every one of those boats had a 37-millimeter gun on the bow when it came in. And every one of those guns was pulled off before the fire was lit. The gun outlived the boat. It always does. PT-39 was not on that beach. She had left the Solomons in August of 1944 and gone home, back across the Pacific, to the training base at Melville, Rhode Island, where boys were still being taught to run these things. When it was over, she was sold a wooden hull, 40 tons, 3 engines. No torpedo tubes. Somebody bought her and made her a yacht. They painted her and renamed her Sea Queen, the 5th. And for years she carried people who had no idea what she was up and down the water around New York City. She burned anyway. An electrical fault, a short circuit at a pier under a railroad bridge in Harlem. The boat that had sunk a Japanese submarine, that had carried a dying Marine off a beach at Choiseul in the captain's own bunk, that had been commanded by a man who would one day be President of the United States, went up in flames at the end of a pier in New York City. And almost nobody watching knew a single thing about her. She had gotten away from the beach at Samar. She had gotten away from the destroyers and the shore batteries and the barges. She did not get away from the wiring. Somewhere in the coral at the edge of Henderson Field, the airplanes are gone now. The jungle took them. What the jungle did not take, the salvage crews did, and what the salvage crews left, the collectors did, and there is grass over most of it. and an airport with a paved runway where the Marines once lived in holes. But for a little while, in 1943, a man walked out into that wreckage with a cutting torch in his hand. He was not an inventor. He did not have a design. He was not authorized, and he did not ask, and he did not write anything down. And when he was finished, he went back down to the water and got on a wooden boat and went out into the dark with a fighter plane's cannon bolted to the bow. And he did it again the next night. And the night after that, we have his weapon. It sits in museums on the bows of the few boats that survived, with the paint fresh and a rope across the deck, so the children cannot touch it. We have the ships he sank. We have the memoirs of the officers and the citations and the after-action reports and the 2 dry sentences in the official history. We do not have his name. We are never going to have it. The Americans said the Japanese called those boats devil boats. Maybe they did. No one has ever found the document, but the men in those barges going in toward the beach at 8 knots in the dark with 10 tons of rice and 70 soldiers watching a shape come at them across the black water with something on its bow that fired 2.5 times a second and turned steel into fire. They called it something, whatever they called it. He built it, and nobody knows who he was.